What if we are thinking about love all wrong? Love is presented to us in a very specific way, and it's probably because it's useful for capitalism, for the modern system that we live in. We are presented with a view of love that's very neatly packaged. You know, Hollywood plot lines and weddings and romance and destinations and honeymoons. Faithful, white, heterosexual couples who buy the right rings and walk down the right aisles, etc. When something in popular imagery deviates from that script, when that imagery changes, it's normally for the purposes of marketing to a specific demographic specifically. Our images that we get of interracial couples and queer couples, for example, are normally just used to sell us things. But love, if you read somebody like Emma Goldman, is deeper than that. Love is a revolutionary act. Welcome back to Champagne Anarchism. All right, let's do this. We are closing out today this incredible book, Anarchism and Other Essays. That means we are covering chapters 10 through 12. Specifically, that is the essays The Tragedy of Women's Emancipation, Marriage and Love, and The Modern Drama, which are the final essays in this book. This is the last video that I'm recording for this reading series, which will take you through from an introduction to Emma Goldman, her thought and her time and the history that was relevant to reading this book, to each and every essay in this collection. And the good news is you don't have to read these essays in order. In fact, it's often helpful if you can skip around a little bit. Find the things that really interest you, dig in there, and you can watch the video that corresponds with the things that you are most interested in. So far, we have covered topics in these essays that range from an anarchist education to Puritanism. You can look back at any of those old videos and find the full discussions over there. You can also check out The Wretched of the Earth, which is a reading series that we've done before, Capitalism, a Ghost Story, and Manufacturing Consent, the Herman and Chomsky masterpiece. I have videos up for all of those books, and you can check all of those out on the Patreon. That's patreon.com/champagneanarchism. All of the main reading series is absolutely free and always will be as far as I'm concerned. I just want to get this information out there, and it's just really fun to do these videos and talk about these things and these big topics, these leftist masterpieces. So please head over there, join the conversation, and I really appreciate all the comments that I'm getting on socials as well. It's really, really awesome to see people really kind of dig into this material. So thank you very much for watching this and for going over there and signing up and for all of your comments. I really, really appreciate all of them. Also, a quick reminder that next week I will be launching the next book in the series, which is Eduardo Galeano's incredible Open Veins of Latin America. If you are interested at all in the history of colonization or the history of Latin America specifically, or old school dependency theory, or you've just seen this book out and you've always wanted to know what it's about, this is a fantastic book to jump into. There's a reason it's gotten to this legendary status in thinkers and activists, and there's a reason it was presented by Hugo Chavez to Barack Obama, and why it was found, a bloody copy was found in the bag of a Salvadoran guerrilla who was fighting against the death squads. This book is just unbelievable. It's changed my opinion about certain things. It has changed the world's view of certain things. Definitely check out Galeano's work. So we will be launching that. There will be an intro lecture up next Friday. So keep an eye out for that. And without further ado, let's get back to Emma Goldman and let's close out this book. Now, I should say just off the bat, this is probably going to be a pretty quick video today because we don't have all that much to cover in these essays specifically. You will find these essays to be fairly short, but the ideas in them are incredibly powerful. This is actually typical of Goldman, who will dive into certain things and kind of skim the surface of other things. And her essays can be very, very persuasive, but they can also be quite short and packed with a lot of detail and a lot of ideas that at the time were revolutionary and even still remain revolutionary. So let's start with the first essay in this collection. That's, of course, The Tragedy of Women's Emancipation. And as you can tell, we are starting off with quite a title here. This is The Tragedy of Women's Emancipation. You might wonder who on earth could argue against the emancipation of women. Goldman can. But Goldman's target is very specific here. And just like the voting essay that we did in the last lecture, we have to be very clear at what her actual target is. Just like voting, she's saying, of course, women should vote, but it won't change anything. Just like that essay here, her target is quite precise. She's saying women's emancipation has meant, in practice, the ability to join men in the labor market, and that is not sufficient. Now, the ability of women, the sort of equal treatment in the labor market, is what a lot of the early feminists, what we may now call the first wave feminists, were fighting for. They were fighting for things like voting rights and equal access and equal employment opportunities. These women were fighting to get women out of the home and into male-dominated spheres like the labor market. And what Goldman here is telling us is when you fight for that sort of emancipation, you are only fighting for external emancipation as opposed to internal emancipation. So women, in Goldman's account, are forced to do two things. The first is they are forced to work incredibly hard in these incredibly demanding jobs that were popular at the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s, this period that Emma Goldman is writing. Remember, this book comes out in 1910, so there's a lot of historical context there. Industrialization and manufacturing bases being built up and these really rough sweatshop jobs and factory positions that were going around. There is a really brutal workplace for the labor force to go into at this point in time. So they have to do that first of all. But then secondly, they have to, after doing all that, they have to come back home and continue to look after a home. Goldman tells us that there's this double burden on women, which I think actually still exists to the present day, even though conditions have gotten significantly better. And she says you also make an essential mistake if you think that you can trade this work at home for the work in the factory and consider that emancipatory. She asks, how much independence is gained if the narrowness and lack of freedom of the home is exchanged for the narrowness and lack of freedom of the factory, sweatshop, department store, or office? And she says that after this, after experiencing these conditions, it's no wonder that hundreds of women are willing to accept a marriage proposal, and we will find out what Goldman thinks about marriage in the next essay, but a marriage proposal after living in these conditions. She also mentions, just kind of in passing, this really interesting comment that I think deserves a little bit of discussion, which is that there's an extra burden on women working in sort of professional occupations. And that extra burden is they have to keep up a dignified appearance. We can think of teachers, for example. So she says working women in shops actually have an inner life that isn't dying off to the same extent that women working in these more professional jobs where they have to keep up a dignified appearance and can't be in touch with their kind of inner nature. They can't access that, and so their inner lives are being suffocated. Now, that's an interesting idea to kick around. I personally think it generalizes way too much, although there is something to that idea, and I also think it applies to men as well to some extent, although significantly more to women. It is a really interesting concept, nonetheless. Anyway, Goldman's idea of emancipation here isn't just the literal emancipation or ability to work in the labor market alongside men, or the ability to join men in these traditionally male-dominated spheres. Emancipation, for Goldman, means women being able to pursue their truest passions. That is a really, really interesting and powerful idea. And she has this neat turn of phrase here where she says, now, woman is confronted with the necessity of emancipating herself from emancipation. And this is what I mean when I talk about Goldman having packed a really big idea into a really small package. There are just a couple pages in this essay, but it leaves us with this idea that yes, you can fight in the legal sphere and the political sphere for equal rights and equal representation, but what you may actually be doing is increasing the overall work burden for women or whatever community you are trying to protect, and not really fostering what we should actually be looking at, which is the inner life, the inner emancipation. And what you might say to this after you read all of this is very much a modern response, which is, well, what about the men? You know, if women are forced to exhaust their vitality in the labor market, isn't it just an argument for men picking up the slack here? You know, why put all of this on women? Why not do both? Why not allow women to join men in male-dominated spheres and also have men go the opposite way, take up more of a position in the home, help out? Why isn't there more partnership and community here? Why are we putting all of this burden on the women to emancipate both their external and internal lives? You know, that's a lot. And that's absolutely true. And it's also true, what I said before, which is now there's a lot more gender equality overall, especially in the workplace. We have a lot more sharing of household duties, although the bulk, I would say, typically still falls on the woman. We haven't really escaped this scenario that Goldman is talking about, which is a little sad because it's been over 100 years since she wrote this book. We're still kind of there, but things have gotten better. But to talk about that question, right? Can't men just do more? We need to look at Goldman's solution for all of this. The solution, she says, and this really shouldn't surprise you, is that we need to change the economic system. And we need to change the economic system completely. She says right at the start of this essay that a lot of the general antagonism that we feel in society, and she's talking here specifically about men and women, but you can give a similar sounding argument for racial inequalities and class inequalities and all of this. But all of that general antagonism that we feel in society, or a lot of it anyway, when we are able to reorganize our social lives based on principles of economic justice, a lot of that general antagonism will fall away. That may sound like a huge claim because what she's really saying is all of these disparities, all of this antagonism, all of this men versus women, white versus black, middle class versus upper class, all of that will start to dissolve and we will become more harmonized with each other if we can just change our economic circumstances. Is that actually possible? I would argue yes. Now, obviously, the problems of racism and sexism cut much deeper than pure economic circumstances, but can we get closer to that harmony? Yes, absolutely we can. And we should remind ourselves here that an anarchist society, what Emma Goldman is fighting for here and what she fought for her entire life, is based on voluntary labor. This is not labor where value is being extracted from the worker. And this is also not labor, by the way, where you do the work because you need to survive, because you are on the edge of a knife in terms of precarity. This is labor because you are motivated to do it yourself. You might help to farm because it helps you and your neighbors. You may build stuff so that your community can use the space. You may cook food because that food is going to be shared. That's kind of the dream here. So Goldman, when she's criticizing women's emancipation, her argument goes so far beyond the labor market because she is looking way past that. She is looking for inner emancipation in every sense of the word here. And when she ends up giving her thoughts on men, she kind of echoes this idea. She says women's freedom is closely allied with man's freedom. And she also, by the way, goes on to say that the tragedy of a woman's life is that the higher her mental development, the less possible it is to find a man who's not just looking for sex, but is looking for her as a companion. That is to say, a man who regards her as just a human being. She says a man who will see in her not only sex, but also the human being, the friend, the comrade, and strong individuality who cannot and ought not lose a single trait of her character. But men, she says, with their sort of ridiculous masculine behavior, their need to protect, their need to provide, all of this nonsense, men make that impossible. And so already you can see this vision forming, which is, by the way, not just a Goldman idea. This runs through a lot of leftist thought, but our social interactions with each other, the division of the sexes, the division of the races, the division between cis and trans and straight and queer, all of this stuff is baked into the system because of the way we have set up our economic relations. Our economic capitalist system forces us to compete with each other, to fight with each other, and to slot ourselves in to these gender roles, these traditional gender roles that Goldman is rightly saying are absolutely ridiculous. And she says at the end of this essay, she has this really brilliant line where she says, a true conception of the sexes will not admit of conqueror and conquered. It knows of but one great thing, to give oneself boundlessly. This is one of the moments that leads us into Goldman's idea of revolutionary love, which I teased at the top. But let's get into the second essay because the two of these flow together kind of perfectly. That is, of course, marriage and love. I'm sure you've noticed by now, but when Emma Goldman takes aim at something properly, it's time to perk up and listen. And that's what she is doing with marriage here. Now, Emma Goldman herself was married twice. Once for love, kind of at the beginning of her life, that ended in kind of crushing disappointment. And then once later on, kind of later in her life, which was just a marriage of convenience, a marriage for visa reasons when she was living in the United Kingdom. So a lot of this is grounded in her personal experience, but she says that marriage and love have nothing in common. You may have heard some of these arguments before. She kind of runs through them. Marriage is primarily an economic arrangement. It's originally, of course, based on ownership. We know that. Marriage is ultimately just kind of an insurance pact. And marriage has this double effect where it condemns women to a life of dependency, and it also chains men, but in a sort of a different way. They are now, in an economic sense, they're meant to provide. They're kind of bound to that role of provider. And Goldman also has this really interesting bit at this point in the essay where she draws on the work of Henrik Ibsen. That's a Norwegian playwright. And she says that we haven't yet outgrown the idea of a woman as an appendage for a man. And so this idea of marriage as a union of equals based on mutual respect, well, Goldman has just never seen that. And Goldman finishes this section by saying, in a practical age, she calls this period of history that she's living through a practical age, and I honestly think we've just gotten sort of more practical in that sense, but in a practical age, like the one in which she was writing, love had been reduced to a question of dollars and cents. She talks about a woman who's just entered a marriage and echoes the language from the previous essay when she says, she learns soon enough that the home, though not so large as a prison as the factory, has more solid doors and bars. And once again, we get sort of an echo of that language, which is that marriage is a prison. It is chains, economic chains that we have forged around ourselves. It has nothing whatsoever to do with love. And then towards the end of the essay, we get Goldman's vision for love, which is love, the strongest and deepest element in all life, the harbinger of hope, of joy, of ecstasy. Love, the defier of all laws, of all conventions. Love, the freest, the most powerful molder of human destiny. How can such an all-compelling force be synonymous with that poor little state and church-begotten weed, marriage? Free love, as if love is anything but free. I absolutely love that passage. I recommend you go back and reread this. I honestly could read just from here until the end of the essay. It's all brilliant, but I do want to highlight just one more passage from this last section. She says, yes, love is free. It can dwell in no other atmosphere. In freedom, it gives itself unreservedly, abundantly, completely. All the laws and the statutes, all the courts in the universe cannot tear it from the soil once love has taken root. I love this section so much. You know, Goldman often, and if you've read any of these other essays, you will see this. She seems like an eternal pessimist. She's always a relentless critic. She's always going in and she's critical of everything, but really, actually, she's not at all. What Emma Goldman really is, throughout all of her work and through the life that she lived, she was kind of incredibly hopeful. And this passage in particular, it reminds me a lot of the George Orwell book 1984. And some spoilers for that book, but in that book, the main character, Winston, is awakened from his somewhat nightmarish, bureaucratic existence by love. The love that he experiences with another character, Julia, who gets very short shrift in that book, by the way. Anyway, that's a totally separate thing. But Winston is kind of awakened by this love, and it's this love that allows him to start to go against and start to realize his situation under the oppression of Big Brother, this figure in government who is this benevolent leader, supposedly. And so he uses this love to kind of counter the power of Big Brother, and it opens up a little bit of space. At the end of the book, Winston's spirit and his love is crushed. You know, Big Brother wins in the end, and he learns in the end to love Big Brother. And just as I'm talking about this, I want to go back and reread this book. 1984 is a brilliant, brilliant book. But what Goldman would likely say is that's actually impossible. That kind of totalitarian obliteration of the human spirit, it's actually not possible. This is humanity that we are talking about here. You know, for us, love for each other is a force like gravity. As much as you can try to kind of uproot it and rip it up, it will remain. And this is it's a beautiful, beautiful vision for the world. And it's one that I find myself agreeing with wholeheartedly. You know, for Emma Goldman, in the end, this vision for this pure, radical, revolutionary love, is so powerful and profound. And we should mention that this vision is something that she's preaching, but she herself, throughout her life, struggled with. Basically her entire life. You know, she's preaching this kind of love and this free love, but she was also painfully jealous of her lover, Ben Reitman, who was off having multiple affairs. But the way I think about this is that all humans are hypocrites to some extent. It's sort of part of the thing that makes us human. We may have as many lofty ideals as we want, we will necessarily fail them. And the vision for this kind of radical, revolutionary love, it remains beautiful and powerful. By the way, I should say, before we end this essay here, this meditation on love through the emancipation of women and love and marriage is, I think, one of the most important parts of Goldman's work. It's one of the things that I think makes her stand out from her contemporaries. A lot of people have written and spoken about the prison system, about an anarchist education, about economics and the economic order. A lot of people have done that kind of work. But Goldman's eternal optimism and her vision of love and the things that it can do for a society, I think is kind of unique. It's what makes reading Goldman so powerful and valuable. Even more than 100 years after this book came out, I think you can still read this kind of work and take something away that is uniquely from Goldman. So it's really cool to be able to close out this book on that kind of note, because this is one of her main, to my mind, her main contributions to anarchism as a movement, is this idea that, listen, you can have all the revolution, you can have all the political violence that you want, but it needs to be underpinned by a radical type of love. And that, to me, is just fantastic. And that's all the rant I will give on this essay. We should turn to the next essay very briefly, the last one in this book, by the way. And that is, of course, The Modern Drama, a powerful disseminator of radical thought. Goldman was a lifelong lover of drama. And actually, when she was finally allowed back in the United States after her deportation, the condition of her returning was, you can't lecture on this anarchism stuff, but you can lecture on drama. So in this context, this is a really fascinating essay. Now, Goldman's argument here is that manifestos and pamphlets alone can't change the way people think, but drama, and in this context it means theatrical productions, and she also references throughout this book a few novels as well, a few poetic works, that sort of thing really can. Now, we won't go through all the tremendous references that she makes. She's incredibly widely read. You can read through at your leisure and pick out certain things that you think sound interesting. I personally am a huge fan of Tolstoy, who she obviously loves, and also Ibsen, who we mentioned in the last essay. If you read A Doll's House, it's still a really, really incredible work. That's Henrik Ibsen, the Norwegian playwright. All of this is really fabulous, but her main point here is well taken, which is people understand things differently when they are presented them through fiction, rather than when they're presented just dry facts. Now, obviously, there's a little bit of irony here, because we are receiving this information through Emma Goldman's essay, which is not a work of fiction, it's a work of fact, but hey, whatever. And I really think that this essay is valuable to us now because it makes us think about the modern world, and I think we should view it through this lens. Our modern equivalent to the drama that Goldman was talking about is unquestionably TV and film. You know, think about all the awesome movies and television shows that have made you think about things, consider things a little bit differently, because you viewed them in a fictional context, because you felt yourself to be part of that, because you connected to the characters who were experiencing something that you've never experienced, but because you can kind of see it through their eyes, you take it on in a different way. And there's a lot of really good stuff out there. In fact, my sister and I run a little bonus podcast thing. You can find that on the Patreon feed that I mentioned earlier. We discuss leftist films on there, and things like Battle of Algiers and all the works of Bong Joon-ho and even The Hunger Games. All of these things can really open our eyes to certain things. But there are limits, of course. And these limits are something that Goldman doesn't really mention in this essay at all. And that's maybe because the way that we produce these things has kind of accelerated in the late stage capitalist system that we live in now. Right now, film and TV exists in a hyper-capitalist system. The movies may have a message, yes, but they also need to sell. And to sell, a movie has to play by the rules of a studio system, which is tightly controlled, or at least a lot of the time it's tightly controlled. You're not just creating something that's good or popular, you are creating something that can appease layers of producers and script notes and all of this stuff that may whittle down the very powerful core of a film. And some of the stories you hear, there's a famous story about Bong Joon-ho, the Korean director, when he made Snowpiercer, going head to head with Harvey Weinstein, who wanted to cut a bunch of stuff out and increase the action, all of this. And Bong Joon-ho is really having to struggle with this system to get his film through with his vision. And a lot of these stories are completely wild. So yes, it is wonderful that there is a thriving space for this, and truly it is thriving. But we need to ask real questions about the sort of material that's presented to us, what we're seeing, and what also are the things that people are actually going out to watch. And I have no big major takeaway from that, just a question to have in the back of your mind next time you go to see a film with a leftist message. And with that, we're going to close out this incredible book and these essays by Emma Goldman. Congratulations if you've made it through this book. This is a really, really fantastic book. I hope it's shifted your perspective a little bit. And if you haven't read the book and you've just watched along with these videos, I hope you take a crack at some of these essays because they are really, really fabulous. Like, they're really, really special. And the fact that we get to read these after more than 100 years and take away messages that still apply to us these days is kind of magical. And we have talked about a lot of things during the course of these essays. We've talked about anarchism, we've talked about feminism, about education, about prisons and marriage and voting rights and radical love and drama. It's a lot. So if you have comments, if you have thoughts about any of this, do not forget to comment. And of course, do all the stuff. Please like, please subscribe, check out the Patreon channel, check out the YouTube channel, check out any number of socials that I'm running or trying to run at the moment. We'll get back on track with all that stuff. But hey, for now, thank you very much for watching all of this. Next time, again, another reminder, we are tackling one of the great works of Latin American history and thought, just a towering book that I wish I had in front of me to hold up. But of course, it is Open Veins of Latin America by Eduardo Galeano. If you haven't read this book, I promise it will change the way that you think about colonization and empire, especially the American empire. You know, you will read this book and you will never think about sugar the same way. You will learn things that you never knew about places like Haiti, about the ways that Spain tried to pretend that they were safeguarding indigenous rights even as they committed genocide of the indigenous people in the Americas. The parallels really to the present day are kind of extraordinary. And Galeano has all of that in that book. So we'll be back on Friday next week to talk about that. If you want all of that and more, don't forget to sign up to the Patreon channel. That's patreon.com/champagneanarchism. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.